Hello and welcome. I'm excited to be here as a part of Keeping Up with Carlin. In this session, we'll be creating a non-traditional watercolor portrait using some mixed media elements. Now, I am an artist who likes to work in many different mediums, and I love the versatility of watercolor. I will often use watercolor as an underpainting for other pieces. The beauty and the versatility of watercolor is amazing to work with. There's so many possibilities. I'm going to show you just one way that you can use watercolor when creating a portrait to add spontaneity and versatility to your work. If you tend to be tight in your work and would like to loosen up, this is a wonderful technique that you can use to do that. We're going to explore lots of different pattern and texture making materials that are common to watercolor work. There's other ways that you can draw your subject onto your paper, but I'm going to introduce one way that we can do this as we begin, and that's called gesture drawing. Gesture drawing is a way to very quickly and loosely gather information from your subject and get it onto your paper. You can see that these are quick little studies that I've done of my subject, just with the effort of trying to understand what it is I'm seeing. I want to understand the forms and then translate that onto my paper. So I'm going to start on Arches paper, 300 pound, and I'm going to begin with a gestural study. I have a subject, that's my focus, and I'm going to look at that and then loosely draw that onto my paper. When I do my gestural drawing, I hold my tool very loosely, much like a conductor would hold a baton. I want my marks to skip and move, and I want to be able to move around my paper in a way that I'm going to prevent myself from drawing very tightly. The goal is to draw loosely. For this technique, I only need to capture the basics of my subject. Now, I like to do this by gesture drawing, but you don't need to. There's other ways that you can transfer your subject onto your piece. I like to do it just because I enjoy the act of drawing, and I like to have my thinking marks evident on my paper. I enjoy the marks that are left. I never erase. So I leave my marks and I allow them to become a part of my subject. And because these are highly pigmented, they leave beautiful marks. They leave marks that can be incorporated and become part of the painting itself. So I think about the marks and I want them to be drawn in a beautiful way. So I'm just capturing my key points of my subject, where the eyes fall, where the nose sits, the shape of the head. Sometimes some of these other elements, these drawing elements, the features, if there's particular fabric or movement in the hair, and I just want to place them on my paper, because what I'm going to do next is use stencils to create interest around my form. Now there's many wonderful materials that you can use to create texture on your watercolor. Watercolor is so responsive that just laying different pattern-making materials into your watercolor can create beautiful areas of interest. I'm going to create a hot glue stencil and lay it over my piece to create areas of pattern and texture with my watercolors. I'll also use other materials like gauze and saran wrap, which are commonly used in watercolor techniques. So after I've gone through the process of establishing my gesture drawing and understanding my subject, really that's the purpose. The point is to understand your subject, because when I'm working, I work from very loose and I get tighter and tighter and more detailed. So beginning loose gives me the basics of my form, and then as I work I develop it and I can bring it to as detailed a stopping point as I want. But another thing that I like to do before I begin is study features. So especially if you aren't very experienced in doing the portrait, it's a good idea to take a moment, take some time, and explore individual features. So this is an example of something we'll walk through together now. This is a traditional watercolor approach on Arches paper, but then some fun elements added, just to give it a little bit of whimsy. So I'll show you how I go about this process, and I'm going to talk about just how to use color to develop the eye in a natural way, but then exaggerate your colors to add some fun and interest. This is a very undeveloped, quick study of a mouth, but we will do the same. We will work through this together so you understand how I apply my color in a way that might be useful to you. Here's another example of a watercolor underpainting, but then I added pastel to add interest and another layer of color development. This is another example of watercolor underpainting to develop my darks and then using pastel pencil over the top to bring in some lights and add some textural interest. So I'm going to walk you through my process as I study the mouth. I begin with a gestural sketch. Now I could do my sketching with my paintbrush, but for the sake of adding another element to your repertoire, I'm going to use the Inktense, and I'm just going to quickly and loosely do a sketch of a mouth. Now there's things I know about the mouth. I know that if I break it down to a simple form, it has an oval in its center. It's basically an oval shape with a bit of a divot that makes up the upper part of our lip, that Cupid's bow. And there's a little bit of a mirror that happens where our lips meet. And then there's this just gentle curve that happens underneath. Usually the lower lip is slightly wider or fatter than our top lip, but that's not always the case. But it has a bit of a flat spot that mirrors this. So you have this form. You could break it up into a rectangular form within an oval, slight dip in the middle, slight dip that mirrors it on top, flat spot at the bottom, and then a gentle curve up on each side and a gentle curve down. So very simplified. The mouth isn't a complicated form if you know how to break it up into its pieces and parts. The trick comes when we start to add color and shadow and highlight. So I'm a pretty messy painter. I don't have a particular palette that I love, and I use many different kinds of paint. I have no brand loyalty. I love the M. Graham paints, Daniel Smith, Winsor Newton. I fall in love with certain colors, and it's important to know, and I'm sure Carlin will talk about the fact that the colors vary from brand to brand. So it's important to experiment with colors that you like and make note of what works for you. It's okay if you have a diverse palette, as long as it's a color it's a palette that you're used to and you know what the colors are going to do and how they're going to respond for you. So, because I work quite dark, I often work on a messy palette, and it works for me. But again, you need to find what works best for you. So when I start painting the lips, I want to think about the colors that are involved. Now I will work in traditional colors, but I will also work in non-traditional colors. I think warm and cool, shadow and light, how the sunlight may be affecting my form. So it's important to have an understanding of where your light source is, where the light is on your form, how it would affect the volume of your forms. So I'll show you I'll talk about this as we go forward. So I'm going to have kind of natural colors in my lips to start. I will start with very wet paint. I like to soften my paint before I begin, and I'll mix on the palette and I mix on my page. So I'm starting with just kind of a mix of some warms and reds. So I'm just going to make a pass on my paper. There's something odd on the surface of my paper. Now this is just a cheap mixed media paper, and there's something that's on the surface of my paper that's slightly repelling my color, but that's okay. I'll work with that. Now I'm just making a pass, bringing some color onto my paper. Nothing fancy, nothing particular. You can see that I'm not even too worried about staying within my lines. You'll find that in my work, and it'll make sense as we move forward why that's okay. I'm adding water around my edges. I'm working quite wet. And I just want to get some pigment on my paper to start. I like to cover my entire page with color. I will usually have a tissue or something handy if it gets away from me, but it rarely gets too far away from me that I can't pull it back in a way that I'm comfortable with. Now right now I'm thinking about what's happening in the shadow areas. I know that because my light source is from above, I am going to have some shadow under the base of my lip and between my mouth, because my upper lip extends slightly out in the center here and also in the center point here, and then it goes back on the sides and it tucks under on these sides. So there's going to be some shadow that's developed here. Where your lips meet is one of the darkest areas on your face. Underneath there'll be some shadow here as well. So I'm just using a slightly cooler passage of color mixed with the color that's already established on my mouth. Now I'm just going to bring some in, and you can see that my paper is quite wet, so it's blending and bleeding, and I like that. I like that looseness of that. I'm also thinking about the form and the volume of my mouth, and I'm making some marks or some lines that help to define that form. I'm allowing these lines to help me to define the fact that there's some volume. If you think about, if you pay attention to your lips themselves, you'll notice that there are lines on our lips. As we get older, those usually become more and more distinct. So by adding some of those lines in this early phase, it helps to create that or intensify that illusion of volume that's happening already naturally on your lips. So I'm just putting some passes of a little bit darker and a little bit cooler color, and I'm going to allow some of these lines to be evident as I'm making my marks, as I'm using my brush. I talk a lot about marks because I'm naturally a drawer. So think of, you could call it a brush pass or a swipe of your brush, but it's the same movement. It's thinking of your marks, thinking of your passages in a sort of a sculptural way, using your brush in a way that it's actually going over and across the surface of that form to help to create volume. And you see I do one color and then I add another and a variation of that color, but it's all within that color family. Now what's going to happen is I'm going to let that dry a little bit, and then I'm going to come back and add more to it. And I'm also going to do a little lifting out. To increase the illusion of volume, I can also at this stage do a little bit of lift out in the areas that would have some highlights. Come back in and paint. Just using a tissue, I can gently dab areas where the light might be hitting those lips. Come back in and add some more marcation of volume. And then as it starts to dry, I can do it even more so. Come back in and add another pass. But it's already starting to have a little bit of a feeling of volume. But when it dries, then I can intensify my color and increase that even more so. So I'm going to set that one aside, and I'm going to start and do an eye. So next I'll walk you through just the process that I use to develop a study of an eye. Again, I start with a gestural drawing, trying to break it down in its simple form. Now I know that there is a sphere that makes up my eyeball that sits underneath my eyelid. So as I'm drawing that eye, I'm thinking about the structure not only of the eye, but what's happening with the eyeball and around that eye form. So if I know that there's an eyeball behind this, it's going to affect how that skin is shaped because it has to stretch over that form. So I know that the basic structure of an eye, you could think of it like a football. But of course it's not exactly that. Every eye is different. But it's a good starting point. If you start with an oval or a pointier oval, which we would think of as a football, it's a good basic starting point that will help you to achieve at least a human-looking eye. Now from there, you have to study your subject and get more and more specific. So on mine, I know that there's a bit of a flat that happens over the top. It tilts down. There's a nice curve that happens. The eyeball itself butts up against this fleshy part that is the tear duct area. It's important that you indicate this line that shows that your eyeball is going back into space. There's also a thickness to this lid that we need to be aware of. The eyeball doesn't butt right up against skin. There's thickness to this skin because this area is actually an opening. So I want to indicate the fact that I have a lid of skin that stretches over the eyeball itself. So there's going to be some thickness above your top line where your lashes come from. So you'll see a thickness here. You'll see the area that is above the eyeball itself. You'll have a thickness in this area where skin indicates the opening of the eye. And then you'll have the structure that makes up, this bony structure that makes up where the eyebrow appears. This is generally deeper and goes back into space, and this comes forward. So we'll be indicating that by light and shadow. We're trying to represent a 3D form on a 2D plane. So it's important that we do that by lights and darks, by value and contrast. So within this eyeball form, I have my colored part of my eye, which is called the iris. Now, this is where the fun part is, because we can do lots of detail and interesting color that happens within that iris, because it's the colored part of the eye. But it's important to remember that the eyeball moves within this shape. It moves in the form depending on where you're looking. So the iris is centrally located on the eyeball, but it can move. It can be indicated in different parts of your eye. Now, the thing that doesn't move within its form is your pupil. The pupil is always centrally located on your iris. So the iris itself can move within your form depending on where your subject is looking. But the pupil is always centrally located. It will be the same distance from here to here to here to here. That never changes. Now it may appear different because of how the iris is sitting in that form, but it is always centrally located. It's very common for people doing portraits to not remember this, and it will cause your subject to have a little bit of a crazy eye. It'll seem odd. If this is off-centered, it'll give your piece a strange look, and you may not know why. But that's the first place to check. Make sure that it is centrally located in your iris at all times. So just a little FYI. So once I have my basic forms indicated, then I'm going to come in with my paint. And I'm going to approach it very much the same way. There's a few different ways that I can do this. I could start by indicating my shadow colors which would be my blues and violets or greens, my darker shadow colors, or I could come in with my more natural fleshy colors. But because I started my lips with the more natural colors, now I'm going to start with cool colors and indicate the eyes just for the sake of demonstration and variety. So I'm going to start with a mixture of blues, and I'm going to just pass some color on this form. Again, I work pretty loosely, pretty free form, not too worried about things blending and moving and crossing each other. But I want to indicate some of the shadow that's going to happen within this eye form to get started. And then I'll build up color layering on top of that. Now I know that my eyeball appears to be white, but it is not white. It will be affected, the white of your eye will be affected by the colors that are around it and how much it is exposed to light or shadow. So right away, right from the beginning, I'm going to give it a bit of a tone. I'm painting mostly with water, but I am going to pass over the top of this form, bringing some cool into that eyeball. Now I may lift some out, but I want to make sure that it's not a pure white. Now the colors that I use vary quite a bit because, as you'll see as we go along, I tend to get a little crazy with my colors because I like that. Even in a traditional, more of a traditional look, I like exaggerated color. So you can see by just indicating some of the darks and the contrast, it's already starting to give the form a little bit of volume. Now I can move my paper around, loosen it up a little bit if it gets too dark, and I can lift out at this stage. I could lift some color off, paint over the top, move it, blend it. That's the nice thing about the Arches paper is you have the ability to lift. This is a mixed media paper which doesn't lift quite as well, but many of your watercolor papers will lift very nicely. But I'm just starting to think of almost sculpting my forms. I'm going to add a little bit of warmth to that. I can do that at any stage. Let those colors continue to blend. This brush is quite small for this. Usually I'll work a little bit larger, but it's okay. You notice that I'm not real concerned about mud. My paper can tend to get a little bit what most people would think is a little muddy, but I have a rescue technique that I use. If my colors get away from me, I can employ a bit of a rescue technique that will help bring it back. Notice that I haven't done anything on the iris quite yet. I want to let that dry a little bit because I want to make sure that my color that I add isn't going to bleed into my white. So I'm just allowing this area to dry before I move in with my color. But because I'm okay with some blending here, I can go in with a dark, it's kind of a dark green. Anywhere I want it to be a softer color, I can do this and allow it to blend and bleed, and it won't be a problem for me. So I'm just going to let this dry, and I'm going to work back into my mouth a little bit more. Now my paper has dried quite a bit, and my color is a little bit dull for me, so I want to liven that up a bit. Now I'm going to bring in some more cools, and I can just go with a pass of color over the top of that. Again, I'm concentrating in my shadow areas, just what you would call kind of glazing color over the top. I don't want to spend a long time in a particular area because I'm not wanting to lift color off of that area. I'm just wanting to add more color onto it. And notice that I'm still doing it in kind of that cross contour or sculptural way, moving around my form, being aware of where my highlights are. I can add more color to it. I can lift out if it gets too dark. But I just continue to work at building up color. Now I could add a pass of warmth to that. I could just add some of a golden color if I want to alter it and exaggerate my colors a bit. Again, in just kind of a glaze, and it can warm up my colors nicely. So you can just continue to develop this, thinking of it in a sculptural way, moving your lines of your brush around your form, creating light and shadow, adding color as you need to, intensifying things as you go, lifting out as you need to, but it's just a simple way to develop a look of the form that is our lips. As it dries, I can continue to work it even more. I can add highlight, I can lift out by adding a little bit of water onto my tissue and just dabbing in. If I've put too much paint down and I can't achieve a lift out, I can use something called a magic eraser, which I'll show you later, and you can remove color from that paper as well. So now I'll add iris to my eyeball and we'll move on to our next phase. So as I add the iris color, I like to make a pass of color over the whole thing. So I'm just creating a pass of color over the top, relatively dark, and then I will do some lift out at this stage to add interest to my eye, and I will add more color in, a variety of color. And if you notice the iris of the eye has the same kind of linear quality to it as our lips do. There is a radiating that happens within those eyes, radiating out from the center point, the pupil, to the outer area of the eye. So it can be a good idea to add some of that in for interest's sake. And I'll also paint water on there, soften it up and lift out as I go. Each of these little these little acts will add another layer or dimension within that eye form that can make it quite interesting. I'm using kind of a large brush, but I'm working still relatively wet, so that works for what I'm trying to do. Now if I'm worried about my colors getting muddy, again, my eye doesn't really matter, but if I was worried about that, I may let it pass dry and then come back in and work on it again once it's set. That way the colors won't mix as much. But I just continue to work it this way, building it up, adding color, adding layers of color, really with an idea of kind of sculpting that form. Looking for my darks, intensifying my darks, and I tend to do it in passes if I'm working with watercolor. In this way I'm working from light to dark, and in the next pass we're going to do the opposite. We're going to work from dark to light, but then we will go back and forth, continuing to build and develop those colors. You can see I still haven't indicated my pupil yet because I'm letting that dry. But I could pull the pupil into the center point and allow it to radiate out a bit. But just indicating that pupil, already it starts to read more dimensionally. Now I'm not a watercolor purist, so rather than saving my whites, I tend to be a cheater and I'll bring whites in with some other tool. I'm a lazy watercolorist. So you can see that my iris, or my pupil, is bleeding into my iris, and I'm okay with that because eventually I will come back and make that crisp, clean center point. But for now, I kind of like that interest that it adds in the iris itself. And the whites of my eyes are still a little bit white. I would probably take another pass and intensify that. But for the sake of demonstration, I'm just trying to show you one approach, some basics on how you can approach the eye, and things to think about as you're developing this form on your subject of your portrait. Sometimes I'll take a misting bottle and I'll spray into that iris because it'll add a little interest and let the colors blend even more. You could add salt to that. You could add other textural making devices, pattern making devices. That can be quite interesting. You can, again, lift out in certain areas, even though I've gone back in. Just kind of fun to play around. But of course, to do this, your portrait has to be quite large. It's difficult to do it on a much smaller scale. You might have to clean up your edges a little bit if they get away from you. But I'll show you another really fun way to clean up edges by using pan pastel later. There's no mistakes that can't be fixed with pan pastel. So that's to get us started, just to get you thinking about the eye and the mouth. Now we're going to move on to using our hot glue gun to create a matte stencil that we will use on our piece to develop pattern. So another way to add some interest in this eye rather than direct painting is by using a manufactured stencil or another stencil or pattern making material. So I'm just going to show you how you can do this real easily using a magic eraser, which I'll talk about in more detail in a minute. By having your eraser damp, you can just gently push through and remove some of your pigment from your page. By pressing through your stencil and then gently dabbing with the tissue, it's going to remove a small amount of pigment from your paper, and you can create some really interesting effects real easily. So rather than direct painting, you can use a reduction method, which we'll use more in our project, to create some really interesting effects. You can also do this to create highlight in the eye. You can create areas of interest around you can get kind of crazy, and you can remove larger portions in a more abstract way. But some really fun things, fun ways to add just some interest to your pieces. So it's fun to experiment with different options and different ways of working. Using this magic eraser to remove pigment rather than just directly painting all the time. Remove some of these things, and then I can let this dry and I could glaze color over the top, and it could become something other than an eye. It could just become an interesting piece of art. So just other options that we'll explore as we move on into the later part of our project. So for our next phase of development of this piece, we're going to be using our hot glue gun. This is a hot glue gun that I purchased from a local hardware store. I like to use a multi or high temp glue gun. Now they come in different sizes, and I've found that if you get a larger glue gun, it's much easier on the hands. If you use it a lot, your hands can get quite tired. If you're using a gun that is very small, you're having to replace your glue sticks often, and it's just much easier to use a larger gun. So I use a gun that is medium to large, high temp. Then I like to use the long glue sticks. Again, because I don't have to replace them nearly as often. The glue gun has a heating element. As you put the glue stick in the end, it grabs hold and it heats it up as it goes. So hot glue will come from the tip of your gun. So just be aware as you're working that this gets quite hot. You'll know that it's ready when a little bit of glue comes from the tip. And when you're ready to add more, simply slip it in. You don't have to remove anything from the shaft itself. It'll just continue to push that glue out. So I have done my gestural study on my watercolor paper, and then I've laid a sheet of baking parchment over the surface because I'm going to develop my stencil based on my gesture drawing. So I'm going to use it to be able to help me to indicate placement of my stencil. The parchment paper allows me to work with my glue gun on the surface without it sticking, and I can easily remove it when it's finished and cooled. So I want to choose an area to begin where it's okay if it's imperfect. The reality is when I squeeze the trigger, glue will come out more readily, faster, and leave a bit of a puddle where I begin. I try to think of working in a way that I can have a continuous motion. I want to be able to squeeze the trigger as I'm making my movement and then end in an area that I'm comfortable with. It may take a couple pumps to get that glue started, and you'll see it comes from the tip, and then you want to squeeze firmly, starting and stopping in an area and a way that you are comfortable with. So now I am going to work to develop a mat created with the hot glue gun. I want to make sure that my glue gun is hot, and I'm going to move in and around my form, creating kind of an interwoven tangle of interest. Now, as I work with my glue gun, you can see that proximity makes a difference. If I'm holding my glue gun high, it makes a unique mark. If I'm holding it close, I can make fatter, interesting lines. I have more control the closer that I hold my glue gun to my piece, but I never have full control. It's one of those things that is relatively organic, and it has a bit of a mind of its own. Now notice here I'm working where one glue stick is ending and the other is beginning. It's a much less fluid motion that I'm able to create. So I need to be aware of that as I'm working. If I have a very delicate mark I'm trying to achieve, I need to pay attention to where that hot glue gun is in its length so that I can prepare and plan. I don't want to interrupt an interesting motion with a globby glue mark. The nice thing about it is I can, if I have a mark that I don't like, something that I'm not content with, I can come back with scissors and simply click that out, cut out that section, and start again. So again, I'm thinking about, it's really like, I want you to think of it in a way like drawing with your glue gun. It's really gesture drawing with this tool. You've just substituted your pencil for your glue gun. It takes some practice. You need to get a feel for what you can achieve, what it takes, how much pressure you have to place on the trigger, but it's worth it because you can create some really interesting, unique, and custom-made stencils designed specifically for your piece. And again, it's kind of fun. If you're one that tends to be a little bit tight and you're working, this can add interest in a fun way. Now notice I'm working around the form. I need to consider the fact that as I'm creating these lines, I want to make sure that they're going to be interconnected. They need to be structurally sound. So when I'm working, I need to be aware of connection points. They can have areas that are not attached, but they need to have certain movements that are directly connected so that your stencil won't fall apart when you remove it from your parchment paper. I also like to work on a relatively flat surface as it is a little easier to work with, but you can work on an uneven surface as well. It's just a little more complicated. You want your stencil to lay flat. Notice you can make thin lines, thicker lines, areas that are more passes of glue, more solid areas of glue. I can make the illusion of dots. My glue gun isn't very warm for some reason, so it's a little harder to squeeze than it usually is. But you should be able to squeeze and have the glue come out relatively easily. That would be your goal. If not, it may be that your glue gun needs to be replaced or that your glue isn't quite hot enough. But you get the idea. It's one of those tools that is relatively easy to purchase. The investment isn't large. They're readily available. And you can use it for you can use it in a lot of different ways. So you want to make sure that when you remove your stencil from the parchment paper that it is completely dry. If you pull it off too soon, it can warp and cause it to not lay flat. So you just want to feel the outer regions and then move towards the center. It can be quite hot, so you want to be careful that you don't burn yourself. But if your outer edges are cool, chances are your center is pretty good as well. So you just gently start lifting the tendrils. When you get to the thicker part, it might be a little more stuck, but it should remove pretty easily. And you just gently pull it off of your paper, and you have a beautiful stencil to work with. So here you can see that I removed my hot glue stencil from my parchment paper, and I've created an intricate matte style hot glue stencil that can be used to create my underpainting for my piece. You'll find that as you remove your hot glue, you want to make sure that it is completely dry, and you can tell that it's dry by feeling it. Gently feel, and if it's cool to the touch, you know that it may be removed. If you pull it off too quickly, it can stretch and warp your stencil, and that wouldn't be good. It wouldn't lay flat. If you pull it off too soon, it will warp and not lay flat. So now I'm going to lift and remove my stencil and set it aside so that when I have painted my background, I can quickly move it in and it will create the pattern that we're looking for. Now, while I'm creating my underpainting, I need to start with a wet surface because I need to work relatively quickly, or there will be no pattern that's left on my paper. If my paint dries too quickly, there won't be a pattern left on my paper. So I need to work quickly by having a wet background to start with. So I like to take a spray bottle and wet my entire surface of my paper and then add my paint directly onto my paper from my palette. Because I started my gestural study with the Inktense, I want to show you how that can be used to your advantage. So, as I mentioned, the Inktense can be used as a beautiful element within your piece. So, to start with a gestural study with a pigmented pencil, you're already adding interest just by the sake of the fact that it is a colored pigment. So I just want to add a little bit of water. When I add the water, what it's doing is it's setting the pigment so that it will become permanent and not move when later water is added. Some of the watercolor pencils or watercolor crayons continue to be mobile, continue to move on your surface of your paper even after you've touched them with water. So that's something to be aware of. The difference between Inktense and some of the other more permanent pigments is that they will not move. So that could be used to your advantage, or that could be difficult, depending on how you're hoping to work with it, depending on the kind of look that you're trying to achieve. I like marks. I like the look of marks and the combination of drawing in my watercolor. So for me, the permanence of the Inktense works very well. Now notice I'm starting on the outer extremities because I want to see how my pigment is going to react before I jump into the face too quickly. So I'm just going to do the same. I'm just going to hit some of that with water, and all of a sudden my portrait is already starting to develop with very little effort on my part. I'm really quite a lazy painter. I look for tools to achieve what I'm trying to say where I don't have to work very hard. So it kind of paints itself. And notice I used a warm and a cool color. I'm really not very particular about my color, but I do think about warm and cool. I like the idea that it's already creating the illusion of shadow just by this simple little gestural sketch. It's giving me some color to work with. I've added warmth to it because I know that I'm going to use some skin tones in this piece. So these marks will just blend and merge with the colors that I'm using as I create my painting. So with a very little quick sketch, all of a sudden I have the feel of a portrait starting to emerge. Now from here I need to work relatively quickly because my paper is quite absorbent. It wants to take and hold that color that I'll be adding. So I don't want to allow my paper to dry before I put my stencil into it, or I will not achieve the contrast of the pattern on my stencil. So I'm going to wet my whole area, very quickly add my pigment, and then lay my stencil into it while the whole thing is wet. I will also make sure before I begin that my paint in my palette is wet as well. If my paints aren't wet and I'm trying to scoop up pigment, I won't be able to work fast enough and my paper will dry before the pattern is created. So you'll see me working rather feverishly. I'm going to take my spray water and I'm just going to mist the surface of my paper. And what I'm doing is creating an underpainting. So I'm going to cover my entire background with paint, and then I'm going to be using a technique where it's more reductive than adding paint. So now that my surface is wet, I'm going to add a little bit more to my face. And you see the pigment stays put pretty nicely because it's the Inktense. And then I'm going to begin to add my color. Okay. So I'm going right over my drawing. Now you'll notice that I'm covering up a lot of this sketching, but some of that sketching will still remain. Now you can probably see why it's important that I didn't do a detailed drawing. If I would have spent a lot of time doing a detailed sketch, I would have lost much of that. It would have been what you could consider wasted time. Now I never consider drawing wasted time because you are building muscle memory, you're gaining knowledge, you are understanding your form more and more, but much of those are going to be lost in the shuffle. So you need to consider that when doing your sketch. Don't spend a lot of time working on an area that isn't going to be saved later. Now, I had mentioned that I use non-traditional colors, and I wasn't kidding. This isn't probably what you think of when you think of hair or headdress, but I like to be able to use exaggerated color, and I do it quite often. You don't have to do this. You can work however you like, whatever your personal palette may be, but you need to think about colors that will interact with one another when they're laid on the page. If you put colors that you know will create mud, then you're going to have a problem. You want to make sure that the colors that you choose are ones that will blend and merge well together. So I usually will do this with 2 or 3 colors. I try to keep it relatively limited palette. You can see I'm working fast, adding color, and it's not drying quite yet. Here it's getting a little bit dry, so I want to add some more water. You don't want that surface to get dry. Keep it nice and wet while you're working. Now, I'm going to add another element, different color. I also like to use paints that are relatively opaque, and I use them very thickly. The paint is kind of dry. I use them kind of sloppy and kind of thick. I like paints that settle or granulate rather than a transparent palette, which is very different. It's background from which is very different from a lot of the way that people paint. But for this effect, I like that look. I like the way that paint reacts for me. All right, now you can see it's still quite wet, and I'm going to lay my stencil into my subject. Now notice that I've avoided the face, and I'll explain why in a second. I want to line up my stencil so it's in the region of the face. And notice it's not a big deal. I can pull it and move it on my paper because it's wet enough. I can still work with it. I want to make sure that my paint is seeping underneath my stencil. So I need to check to see if that's happening. I can tell pretty easily by the fact that areas of the glue are still light and other areas are dark. Where it's dark, you know that paint is seeping beneath that stencil and it's making contact, and you'll have contrast. If it's not, you need to make sure that it is, and you may need to do that by adding more pigment or more water or both. But I like to come back in and through and around. I'll even spray it, adding more water. My paper gets quite soggy, but what it's doing is it's causing this drama. If I don't have that, or if I work too slowly, I will not achieve the effect that I'm looking for. And I really want dramatic background. The background becomes just as important to me as the portrait itself. Now this theme, I'm kind of thinking a carnival, kind of a masquerade. A lot of my work is kind of whimsical, kind of narrative, tell a story. So I like that. Now notice that there's some splashing that's happened on my face. I really like that too. I let it just develop. I like to kind of be forced to deal with issues that develop as I'm painting. Now notice there's a section that I didn't get paint under. So I'll just add paint under and continue working. This is great for those that like to work a little free, or for those that never work free and would like to, because you are completely out of control on a lot of levels. You're just letting it develop and working with what you have. Now, there's areas here that don't have any texture, patterning. Now, I could come back and I could add other devices like saran wrap or wax paper, salt, gauze. Any of those things could be added in and among these, the things that are already present, just to add more interest. So consider that. Or you can just leave it be and it can be kind of a resting place. But it's a fun way to work. Now I'm going to let this set just for a few minutes, and then I'm going to come in and do my face. And the reason for that is I don't want my face to completely blend into my background. So I want to let it set so that it'll limit the amount of blending that takes place. But first, I'm going to add some sparkle. I have a paint on my palette that is it's called Duochrome. And it has a little bit of bling. It's kind of fun. Not for everyone, but it's interesting as it settles in the stencil markation. It adds just a little bit of shine that I've found very interesting, especially in this kind of a theme where sparkle can lend itself well. So I'm adding just a little bit more water and pigment around the outside edge, and I'm going to apply a few more texture pattern making devices. Notice that I'm leaving the face alone as it's starting to dry a little bit more. I want it to set so that the outer area and the inside won't merge too much. I'm just adding a little more paint, a little more pigment. Notice there's some areas that I see aren't making contact, so I can either decide to add more there or let it be the way it is. Sometimes I find that I need to weight my paper. I need to put something heavy on top of it to help it lay flat. That will also help encourage the stencil to make contact with the paper. Saran wrap can help in this. Just laying saran wrap on top of the surface can help press this heavier glue stick stencil down as well. So it can be a useful device. Putting some wax paper just for the sake of variety and to see what we get and what we like. This is set up a little bit, but I'm going to add a little more pigment in there as well. I'm going to take gauze and I'm going to add gauze in the upper region, and then I'm going to allow that to go onto the face. But for now, I'm just going to lay it into the wet paint and then paint through so that I know that there's good patterning going to occur. Sometimes if you lay it on, the pigment doesn't actually go into the gauze and you don't have a dramatic effect. It doesn't make enough contact to have impact. All right, so now, because I know I'm going to have her face be in a little more of a traditional color scheme, I'm going to paint colors accordingly, but I will again exaggerate my colors. I don't want to completely lose this eye form, so I could at this point, re-indicate some of these lines if I was afraid that I might lose them. So I might just indicate with my Inktense, go in and just darken or heighten some of these key components. But I'm going to be working relatively quickly again, covering that paper, so I don't think I'll have a lot of that area lost. I'm just going to start with a kind of a medium brown that's a little bit warmed up. So I'm just going to lay my color in with lots of water. Now I can lift this area up if I want to, because I know I want to get some pigment underneath my stencil, or I could just paint through my stencil. But notice that as I do this, it's turning dark, so I know that my paint is being effective. It's seeping under that stencil in a way that I want it to. But by starting with kind of this medium brown, I know that I have something to work with that will have a fleshy feel. But again, I'm allowing it to be a little exaggerated in its color. I can warm that up or I can cool it down. It's just a medium warm brown at this point. Now one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to add the gauze to my face. So notice I just let my paint go right over the top of my sketch. Again, another reason I don't want to have a lot of detail happening there, because if I spent a lot of time working, I would lose that. So just letting it be in there, and I'm going to add a little bit of pink in the general area of my lips and cheeks, but I'm not getting finicky. And then I'm going to lay my gauze into that half of the face and paint through that and allow the gauze to create an interesting texture on that face as well. So it'll have a fleshy natural color, but it'll be more than that. And then you'll see how I lift out color to come back to the color that I'm ultimately going for as it relates to a face. Now I want to incorporate, kind of connect the outer hair region with this face patterning. Again, we're thinking kind of masquerade. So I'm going to allow some of these same colors to creep back and forth and connect and kind of mix together. Here I'm painting through the stencil. I can lift it up and I can paint under. It's not a problem. It's pretty easy to work with. Now I have to decide what I want to have happen on this pattern, so I can move my gauze around and work with that. But I want to make sure that good contact is being made. And it's still, for me, this is relatively light, this face, so I'm going to add a little bit more color, a little more pigment to it, and darken it up slightly. I'm leaving a little bit of that blue of the eye because I don't want to have to lift as much out later. So now I'm going to just add a little bit of blue for interest. Allow some of this to creep in, and by mixing that cool and that warm, I'm creating a new color, but it'll add interest underneath the stencil. I'm using a cobalt green that is a very heavy pigment, so it will leave some interest on my surface as well as it creeps under the stencil. So that is pretty much where I will let that end. I might add, I'll put a little something. Yeah, I don't like that, so I'll take that off. So notice I have a little bit of pooling there, so I want to smooth that out a little bit, but again, for what I'm going to be doing, it's not going to matter that much. But I can take some water and just smooth it out. I'm not developing any of my darks. I may come back and want to emphasize a little more line work to pull out those eyes, but I can do that at a later point. Now notice none of this is making contact here. If I wanted to, I could, even at this stage, I could come through and I could just add Make contact here, add a little bit more paint, and then I could get some of that gauze patterning to show up through the stencil as well. Notice I'm not real picky about what happens. I like the challenge of working with what I have. It's more fun. So she's going to go and set for a little while and dry. We want to make sure that the stencils are at least 3/4 dry before you remove them from your paper. If you let them dry overnight, sometimes the stencils will actually stick to the surface of the paper and pull some of that pigment up with it. So I like to remove them before they're 100% dry. But even if you separated some of the paper, you could just come back with your paintbrush and hit it and cover that up pretty nicely. So it's not really a problem. But I'll let that dry for probably, in our climate here, it would take at least several hours. Other places like Arizona, it may just take a couple hours, but because of the thickness of the paper and the thickness of the stencil materials themselves, it takes a bit of time to dry. My paper is still a little bit wet, but I want to see what kind of drama my stencil is achieving. So I want to carefully lift my hot glue stencil to see what's happening beneath. Now you can see that there's quite a bit of drama and interest. At this stage, if I felt like I wanted to have even more color or more dramatic patterning, I can still go through and add more pigment to my paper to increase that. So I can see that it's drying, but I don't want to peel it off quite yet. I want it to set and let these areas that are still a little bit wet dry. So now that the stencil is removed, I am left to discover my beautiful patterning. The wonderful thing about the pattern making materials is they create unexpected results. You never really know what you're going to get, but it will always be interesting. And what's good about that is it forces the artist to have to make decisions. You would probably never choose to paint an area like this, but now that it's there, you need to decide how to handle it. And it's very good for us to think in different ways where we're not always in control. So you can see some of these areas that the paint is a little bit heavier, more dense pigment. It creates opaque settlings. Other areas where it's more sheer, you have a different effect. So there's a wonderful variety that takes place within your patterning. Now I'm using the Inktense to intensify some of these areas. I can use the Inktense or I can use a paintbrush. It just depends on what you're the most comfortable with. For me, again, I like to draw, so I like the control that I have with my pencil, but I'll work interchangeably. I like to at least come in and intensify some of my darks either with the Inktense or with a brush, just so that I don't lose them as I paint. We talked about some of those key points that are darkest on your face. I like to find those right away. That would be my pupil, above the eye because there's shadow created because of the thickness of that lid. Also under the nose, because the nose protrudes, it's a form that comes off of your face. There's typically a shadow that is very distinct beneath the nose. Shadow beneath that upper lip. Your upper lip is usually slightly darker than your lower lip. So just paying attention to those things as you begin to develop the darks and the lights and the contrast in your piece are good to do. So once I've found those pieces, those parts that are dark, I'm going to take either water or pigment and I'm going to just make a pass of water over the top so that my Inktense will set. Again, it needs to be activated and set by water, so I'm just painting directly over the area that I marked. Now I could have done that with just paint, but I like the act of drawing, so I usually will do a little of each. Maybe I add a different color and alter that color by painting over the top of it. Maybe I just hit it with plain water. But that way I know I'm starting to establish the darks and lights right away. Now, the next tool we're going to use is one of my favorites, and it is the Magic Eraser. And I'm sure Carlin has mentioned this before. Magic Eraser, very useful for removing pigment from the surface of your paper. Now, when it's used traditionally, it can become an issue, something to be aware of when you're removing your pigment from your surface of your paper. If you're pressing too hard, or your paint is too wet, or you're using it a lot, it can actually rough up the surface of your paper in a way that will alter the way that the paper accepts pigment in the future. So it can become a bit of a problem or get out of control. But for my technique, because I'm going to be adding mixed media to this, it's actually an advantage. So I like the fact that it roughs up the surface of my paper because it helps me hold the pigment that I will be applying later. So it's a good and bad depending on how you use it. Same materials, but what you're trying to achieve, it can be a problem or it can be a benefit. So I'm going to start by removing some of this pigment very specifically, very intentionally, to create the illusion of highlights on my face. That will help, again, to bring volume, but I'm doing it specifically so I want to leave some of this patterning, these interesting things there, and work with what I have. Now I've created a couple little tools to use my Magic Eraser with a little more control. I have just a squirt bottle, a little bottle that I've taken the top off of, and I stuck a piece of Magic Eraser into it, and it gives me just a little bit of more control. I also have a watercolor brush. I've removed the brush from a watercolor pen and filled the reservoir with the Magic Eraser itself, so I can use it more like a drawing tool. So it's just a way to hold on to it. I just dip it in my water and it dampens the Magic Eraser that's inside, and then I can use it to draw with. But I need to have some tissue to dab with. We've talked about the fact that we need to establish a light source. And for me, I see the light source as being this side of the face. I want to allow these lights to remain, and I want to just emphasize some of these areas that I know would receive light if the light is coming from this direction. So I have my Magic Eraser is slightly damp. I don't want to have it wet. If it's too wet, it'll just puddle and cause problems on my page. So I want to have it slightly damp, and I just want to think about moving across my form as though the form had the dimension of a face. So I like to tell my students, think about if you were applying makeup or applying clown paint to your face. How would you do that? If this was your tool, how would you do that if you were applying it to your own face? And work that way around your form. Think of the volume of the form. We're trying to create an illusion of a three-dimensional form on a two-dimensional surface. So even the way that we handle our tool can make a difference. So I'll just show you what I mean. So on the nose, I know that there would be a highlight because the nose is actually protruding out from my face. The light is going to catch it in a way that it will cause it to be lighter. So I'm putting a pass with my eraser, and I'm just adding what would become kind of a shine on that nose. Now, I know that there is a form, it moves down and out from the nose structure. So I'm actually using my tool in that way. I'm pulling down and out. There's a bit of a protrusion that happens because of the structure of our teeth under the skin on our upper lip. So I want to indicate that. Comes down and around my jaw form. There's a bit of a bulge that happens below the lip, again because of the structure of the teeth. So I want to indicate that. And I'm just lightening this area, but I'm thinking about how to move. I'm not just randomly scrubbing paint off the surface. I'm thinking about the form and the bony structures and where my light is hitting my subject. Again, we know that we talked about the fact that there is an eyeball that fills in this structure. There's a bone that's happening above by the eyebrow. There's a bone that creates that structure of the zygomatic arch. It's this cheekbone, we would call it. So it protrudes out, so that's going to hit light, or light is going to hit that structure and be lighter. And then as it approaches the eyeball, it's receding in space. So there's usually a little bit of a shadow that happens here. There's also light that hits this area above the brow arch, typically. So just by indicating a few of those things, all of a sudden it starts to read as volume. And notice I've done very little work. I'm a lazy painter. So I've done just a few key spots to help it to read as structure. Now I could hit a highlight on this nostril. It flares out a little bit. So by adding a little bit of a highlight there, it'll feel as though there's some volume. This nose has a bit of a ball structure to it, so I might need to soften that. And I'm just using my magic eraser in this stick form. Light will usually hit a bit of an arch as where the nose comes into that structure that creates the brow bone under the eyebrow. This is a little bit darker, so I'm having to work a little bit harder. Sometimes you need to make your mark and let that magic eraser kind of settle in there, let the paint soften, and then come back and lift it out. There will usually be some light that happens above this structure. I don't want to remove all of it because I want that patterning to take place, but it needs to make an appearance to help that read as light hitting it. So I'm really painting with my magic eraser. By reducing, removing, I'm using it like a paintbrush, but removing paint rather than adding it. Some paper lifts easier than others. You can see here I want a little bit of a highlight on that upper eye lid, again because light would be coming and it would hit, it would line up with this. If the light passage is happening here, it would be consistent. There would be light here, there would be light here, there has to be light here. There'll be some light under this eyeball. It'll hit some of the flat surface that we talked about under the eye. There'll be some highlights that happen there, again on this bony arch, and then down onto the face. So by knowing where to put key components of light, you can very easily start to give dimension to your portrait. I'll get that a little lighter. Because I don't leave whites on my paper, I need to have a solution to be able to bring my whites back into play. I do that by adding pastel pigment to my paper. So I don't worry about saving whites in the early process, but I bring my whites back in later. But I'm still bringing lights in. Now I know that usually to make that lip appear as though there's dimension, I need to bring some light above that lip. There'll often be a little bit of a light that crosses across the other side. There's this little I don't know what it's called. I never remember what that's called, but there's under our nose, there's that divot above our lips. So by indicating a little bit of that, again, it gives form and dimension to that area. Highlight on that lower lip. As the lower lip bulges forward a little bit more, it's going to catch more of the light. So by removing some of that, all of a sudden it reads as volume. It will usually catch the chin. So a little more there. Now I can also go in and around these areas, and if I want to make this appear more dramatic, by removing some, it'll feel more like there's a pattern of filigree laid onto her face. It'll help to incorporate and integrate the two well, just by removing a little bit of that pigment. I can also paint directly and help to intensify some of that line work if I want to. But I'm able to make those decisions working around my form in a very simple, reductive way. That's kind of fun. It's playful. You have to make decisions as you work around your piece, and you let it develop rather than trying to force it to be what you want it to be. You let the piece sort of direct and dictate the direction that you take, and that can be may not be the way you work typically, but it's a fun way to work occasionally, just for something a little bit different. It's fun to try. Now, if I look at my piece and I decide there's areas that I really don't like, there's some area that I decided that I wanted to make a change, I could also use the magic eraser and remove a large section. Back up a little bit. I could take and just eliminate a large section and repaint it or repattern it. So for the sake of demonstration, I'm just going to do that. I'm going to lift out a section and show you what I mean by that. There's really not any areas that I don't like. I like it a lot, but for the sake of demonstration, I'll do that, and then I'll show you some other ways that you can lift out to add even more interest. So I'm going to remove some of this just to create a separation so we see a little more background and a little bit more foreground. So by taking a larger magic eraser and just gently wetting and then kind of scrubbing lightly on my surface, I can remove much of that pigment that's present. Now I need to dab as I go, and I'll need to sometimes clean my magic eraser, but I can selectively remove areas to create a new passage. Now you may find that some of those lines, those ghost lines, remain, and for me, I love that. I like the look of that, so I'm okay with it. But if I needed to, I could remove that, or I could alter that by drawing over it with my pastel. But for now, I'm using this just to remove some of the pigment of the paper in larger masses. And you just there may be something specific you're wanting to achieve, so it's nice to know that you have that option. Now next, I'm going to use manufactured stencils and work through them to add another layer of dimension. So because we started with this massive craziness, it's harder to design your composition ahead of time. You need to think about and make decisions on the fly while you're working. So as I began to assess this patterning and I start to think about it as a piece rather than just this beautiful mess, I need to consider some compositional elements. Now, I've placed the face off center, and that was something that was a conscious decision as I made my stencil originally. I want to make sure that if I'm working with a portrait, it's a good idea to just have it slightly off center from a compositional standpoint. We rarely want to place our subject, our area of focus, directly in center. But because there's so much movement and patterning happening around the piece, I need to consider these as important elements as well. There's areas and passages that can become very dominant if I'm not careful. The face is the focus, but some of these areas can capture your attention, and I want to allow these to be a benefit to the piece rather than a hindrance. So I want to think of them as masses of movement that can direct the viewer in and around and through my piece. This area captures your attention because of the contrast. It's a focal point. We are almost always drawn to a person's eyes because that's how we communicate. So that's a natural focal point. But because of this other textural patterning interest, it's even more so. And then because of the light and dark next to each other, it's even more so. So this will be my focal point. Even if I try to change it, it would be very difficult to not have that be my focal point. But I want to create a balance and an interest around my piece as well. I don't want my viewer to just stay here and not investigate these other beautiful places. As the artist, we're in control, and we should learn to direct our viewer where we want them to go. Carlin is wonderful at this with her passage, her path of light, the creation of the path of light. The viewer can't help but follow these paths of dark and light that she creates in her work. The same kind of things apply here. You want to use the darks to move your viewer around, and you want to use those lights to help direct the viewer where they want to go. And then we have the additional element of the direction that the patterns are creating. So we want to think about, it's lots to think about, but we want to think about those things as we're working. I created this lift out light area because I want the viewer to come forward. This helps to identify that there's something else happening. It's not all of this patterning, this person isn't on the same plane. Just by adding some lights here, it helps the figure to come forward a bit. So I also can create passages of movement by laying in manufactured stencils that have a specific look, a specific direction, or movement to them. So, for instance, this piece has a very clear direction. Now, if I place it this way, it moves you in and up. If I place it this way, it brings you down. So you think about the marks that are happening on your paper and ways that you can slightly alter them to emphasize movement. Now, just for the sake of example, I'm going to show you what I mean. If I want to intensify or amplify this movement that's already happening, I could add a little something like this, just using my magic eraser, going through the stencil, and all of a sudden that movement will be even more intensified. And it may be subtle, but it'll be there, and it can be a helpful, a useful element to direct our viewer. So just a little bit of that. It has a bit of a feather form, but it even more so draws you in. You can break up an area that maybe gets too solid. You can take a stencil and you can just lift some areas out and add just another area of more interest, more texture. I can do the same thing let's see, I could create a look of a specific shape. There's these shapes that are happening here. I could lay in a shape just by lifting out some, and I can emphasize more shape. So not using a stencil as the stencil itself, but using parts of the stencil to try to communicate or direct your viewer, to say something, add something that's missing, or emphasize and reinforce what you already have happening. It's just a fun way to use these manufactured stencils. Now I could even do that on the face. I could lay it in and add more texture on the face. But I'm going to show you another way to do that, a different way to do that. Let's see. Take a passage. So a magic eraser is really a fun thing to play around with. If you haven't used it, it's definitely worth exploring. And that's the reason why I like to start very dark, because I have the ability to pull back much further than if I started very light and tried to paint through my stencil. It wouldn't have the same effect, because you can, by layering and removing, you can create these ghosts that build layer upon layer upon layer. And that's something that I really love in my own work. I like to be able to build up a layering effect, a layered look. So I'm going to add a couple more, and then I'm going to show you another way to use, but now with adding color rather than removing it. So again, emphasizing, it's kind of, all of a sudden there's kind of the thought of a collar, or gives a little more structure just by adding or removing a little bit of paint. I'm going to add a little bit more color on my lip by painting it, and I'm going to do, like we talked about before, I'm glazing. I'm just adding a thin layer of paint over what is already there. I don't want to change what's there. I just want to heighten that color a bit. Just adding a touch. Now I can do the same thing in some of these other areas. If I want to emphasize some of this patterning, cause it to be a little more distinct, so I can remove and I can also add. I have this structure that's happening here. I lightened it up, and if I glaze over it carefully, I can still retain the value, the contrast that's happening, but change the color itself. So when I work back in, I usually work back in quite tentatively, just adding layers and thin glazes of color rather than strong passages of solid color. I just want to alter those colors slightly, warming them up or cooling them down. And notice I work with a pretty big brush. The tendency or the temptation, if you work with a small brush, is to get very tight, and I want to avoid that. So I'll try to work with as large a brush as I can for as long as I can, because then I don't have the temptation to follow my brush, follow my nose to the tip of the brush. And that can be something that can be really handy depending on what you're trying to achieve, but I want to maintain the looseness and the expressive quality of the painting, so I don't want to get too tight too quickly. Now notice I haven't done a lot with the detail of the eyes. The eyes are quite small, so I don't have a lot of ability to get in there with my brushes, but I'm going to work on the detail of the eyes with a pastel pencil. So now I'm just adjusting my colors a little bit, deciding what I want to alter and what can stay the same. Bring some colors into areas where I feel like I just need to change it slightly. Usually I alter it very little. I just emphasize what's there. I like to let it remain and become within the color family, the color range that's present on the paper. Just improve upon what's there rather than changing it completely. So I would say that this is pretty close to being at a place where I would then add some mixed media. Now this piece is done on watercolor paper, so I want watercolor to be its main voice. I still want to retain the quality of the watercolor and have it feel like a watercolor. So I'm going to add mixed media very tentatively and very specifically so that I won't change the fact that this is a watercolor piece. If I jump in and add too much mixed media, all of a sudden it won't feel like a watercolor anymore. It'll feel like a mixed media. Now there's times where I do that. I do allow it to become much more mixed media than watercolor. And I just use the watercolor as a vehicle to achieve a very different effect, where I use much more pastel than I do watercolor. And I can show you an example of that. If I decide I want to create more of a pastel piece rather than a watercolor, I will start with a watercolor underpainting and then use more pastel. In this piece, I'm using mostly watercolor and I'll add some pastel. An example of a piece where a watercolor underpainting came first, but I knew that I would be developing it quite a bit with the pastel is this one. This piece was developed with watercolor underpainting with the intent of adding quite a lot of pastel to it. I allow bits and pieces of the watercolor to show through, but I knew that ultimately it would mostly be covered up with pastel. But it allowed me to develop my colors in a way that would be interesting. So there's different ways of applying this technique. Again, we're mostly focusing on watercolor, so I'll show you how to have watercolor be your main voice and add pastel to it. But you're not limited to that. You can go about it in different ways. When I do this technique, I use a different paper because I need a paper that holds more of the tooth of the pastel rather than the watercolor paper itself. So you can see that the pattern of the gauze is quite evident here, and I like the look of that, so I probably won't touch that at all. You can see that I still have some marks of my pencil present, and personally I like that look, so I allow those to remain. Same thing with the eyes. I like the fact that I can see my thinking lines, so I will mostly allow those to remain. I probably will soften some of these passages and lighten them, but it will only be slightly, and I'll use that with the pastel, or I'll use the pastel to do that. But a lot of what's happening here will remain just as it is. I'll just pick areas selectively and alter them only as needed. So very little, as little altering that's needed. I will do as little work as possible. I talked about the fact that I'm going to add some mixed media to this piece to bring some more lights and more color into the piece. So I'm doing that by adding pan pastel. Now pan pastel is a pure pigment form of pastel that is held together by a special binder that allows it to be relatively dust free. So for those who are concerned about dust that is often created by working with pastel, this eliminates most of that issue. They are a little different to work with than the standard chalk pastel, but they're highly pigmented, very high quality, and really lovely to work with. So if you think about how we use these, if you've ever applied makeup, you can apply pan pastel. The motion that we use and the tools that we use are very similar to those that we apply makeup with. So pan pastels are available with these holders that have interchangeable foam tips. They come in different shapes and different designs depending on the look that you're trying to achieve. They also come in large foam pad forms that, if you're working with larger areas, can be very useful. So there's a wide range, a good variety of options that way. You can also use a more traditional makeup application brush as long as it has a foam tip rather than like a Q-tip or a cotton tip. You don't want to have anything that will leave residue or residual fibers on your paper. So to explain how we use these, I use them very much in the way that I do my application of my watercolor paper or my watercolor pigment. I start dark and then I work light, because as we add light, we're picking up the colors that are underneath a particular color to create a new color. So, for example, if I am looking to create a color in this range, I will look to the darkest point of that color and try to find a color in the pan pastel that's similar and alter it slightly. So here I may dip in a couple different colors of my pan pastel to create this color, and I'm just gently smudging it on my paper's surface, slightly altering it as I go. I'm barely changing it, but I'm altering it just slightly, softening it and adding pigment. It's good for areas that maybe you have difficulty blending with the watercolor paint. You just want a little area of softness. It can add a smooth, really rich area of color. And it's especially nice for portrait work because the ability to get soft, flesh-like movements, you can do it. You can achieve that very easily using the pan pastels. So smoothing areas, softening. It also has a good ability to cover. So some of these areas where there was pencil lines, if I decide I don't want them, I just very gently go over the top of it and it covers it right up. So that's why I say I don't have to save the whites, because I can bring those lights so easily with my pan pastel, and yet it still feels like a watercolor. It doesn't have a very different kind of a look. A little highlight under, reflected light under that nose. Now, again, there's different kinds of tools. If I needed a finer tip, I would go to a tool that has a fine point. Sometimes it's just very difficult to get in there and get the color that we want with a thicker brush, so you find one that works. You see, I'm adding very little pigment to the surface of my paper, just enough to help to emphasize the things that I want to emphasize. Now, we talked about light, my light source on this side of the face. If I put a highlight here, I want to have a highlight that reflects underneath it, and it's going to give that eye dimension. I can also add some white over the top. I'm not altering the whole area, I'm just adding a little bit of light to it to cause it to read like that eyeball is wet. So it's starting to read as though there's some dimension there. Also add a highlight in the eyeball itself. I can add more on the nose. Now I'm doing kind of a mix of fleshy lights, not pure white at this point. And I'm thinking, I always say, you know, I think like a sculptor. You wanna think like you are working on the surface of a dimensional form and how you move and hold your tool. Add some areas of highlight in that mouth. I can mix colors, creating a new color, some reflected light, really easily, just a little touch, a little bit of color. I can also think linear, like we talked about, adding some mark volumes. So real simply adding some color can change it quite a bit. So now I'm going to pull some color into my background. I could paint it directly in, or I can use the pan pastel to alter a color. I can also work through my stencils, again adding color that way. So for the sake of demonstration, I'll show you how I can do that. This stencil has kind of a floral look to it, and it's quite open. There's large areas. So it's gonna, as I work through it, it's gonna leave larger passages of color. So rather than using my small tool, it makes sense. I'm always looking for the best tool for the job. So it makes sense that I would choose a larger tool rather than a small. So I will just pick up some color from my palette. I have to hold it very still because I don't want it to jump away from me. And I can just go over the top of that stencil. So by working through my stencil, I can add some interest, adding pigment. Very much like we did in a reductive way, but now we're adding pigment through. So I can add just a nice soft edge. Just another way to, again, build more dimension. In my work, I'm really interested in layering. I love layers. So any way that I can add more interest that way, I enjoy that. And you can do it in a very subtle way or in a more dramatic way. Just a little bit of line work. Now I could draw those in, but it's easy to do it this way, and it's kind of interesting because it's a little more irregular than if you just drew those forms directly. Another thing that's kind of fun with the pan pastels is it has, they have some iridescence. So for those that like the bling, just by going over some of these areas with a little iridescence, it creates a beautiful kind of sparkle, just real subtle sparkle to it. So kind of fun. Just another possibility. Now I'm going to add a little bit of pencil mark. Now the watercolor paper, I'm working on 300-pound Arches hot press. So the surface is relatively smooth, and the pan pastels respond very well to this, but if I'm building up with a more traditional chalk stick form, not as much pigment grabs onto that surface. So I can't build up as much layering as I may like, but I can achieve quite a bit of detail with the pastel pencil. So I usually, if I'm working on watercolor paper, I will work with a pan pastel in conjunction with the pastel pencil. So I'm going to add some of those marks now as well. So now I want to begin to incorporate some more texture to my piece, and I like to do that by adding some line work. And it's easily achievable with the pastel pencil. Now the paper itself, as I mentioned, is somewhat limiting. I can't build up as much layering as I may like to. But because I'm not adding, my intent isn't to add a lot of pastel to my paper's surface. I can get away with it. I'm going to take my pastel pencil and just begin, very much like we did in a gestural way, I'm going to begin adding some lines and marks to my paper surface to add another additional layer of color. So I usually gather a number of pencils that I think I'm going to use, and I have them handy. I work within the color range that's present, or occasionally I'll introduce a complementary color if I really want to pop. So I may layer red over green or green over red, so that it'll give a real vibration, a color vibration. But for now, I'm going to work within a limited range of the colors that are already on my page. So I can hold my pencil like I showed when I did my gesture drawing, very loosely, like a conductor with a baton. The idea is I want to be able to move freely around my paper. And I'm not covering things up as much as I am adding more color interest to the areas, so it's not such a flat passage of color. Now, I like this green that's happening here, this kind of tealy turquoise, and I want to maybe let some of that creep into the background a little more. So I will just go right in and around it and add some of that color, just slightly, but I'm altering that passage around it. I'm bringing some of that color out and extending it. Same thing here. Maybe I want to bring more of this passage of this painted area, but I didn't paint it. So I can just add some pastel to bring that in and join it, very simply altering that color. So you're not limited. If you forgot to paint something a specific color, you can come in with these pastels and achieve that color in a really interesting way, even though you may not have painted it originally. So it works good as a slight modification tool. Say I want just a little more purple happening here, and I didn't paint it. I can come in with my purple pastel and develop the purple that way, altering my colors. Now notice I'm going in many different directions. I will typically do that. I'll typically let my pencil move in different ways so that I'm not creating just a specific direction that can become a design element. I don't want to create a tic-tac-toe board of marks. I want to create variety within that mark so that it feels more like a passage of color than it does a mark itself, or a mark for mark's sake. Now the same is true if I want to alter a color here. If I want to bring more of that pink in, I can find a color that is in that similar family, and by layering color over the top of it, I can make them feel more integrated. So in this area here, I could come in and I could paint or draw in between these sections with my background color, and all of a sudden that pattern becomes more distinct. So very selectively choosing areas, I can emphasize or de-emphasize areas that I want to create interest. The same is true on the face. If I decide I want to bring some of my face color up, I can do that with the pan pastel, or I can do that with a pencil. I just need to have a color that's kind of in that color family to work with, and I can alter that slightly. I can come in, bring that color up. I can even mimic the look of the gauze. If I decided I wanted to have more of that gauze look, I can alter it, and I can recreate it or replicate it. And I like marks, so I like that there's marks on my paper. I can go into here and I can bring some of this warmth that's happening here down into the cheek if I need to. So very easily just alter and change my color passages. I can bring more orange into the mouth. If it was kind of segregated by color, I can change that just by making some marks. I can create a highlight on the lip. Oh, that's more of a gray. I can create a highlight. I can create some feeling of volume and dimension by adding some lines to those lips. So the possibilities are endless. I could develop this to a very realistic looking piece, or I could leave it more loose and gestural like this. But you have a good amount of control between the pastel pencils and the hand pastels as far as the variety of marks and the look of your marks. You have endless possibilities, interesting things that you can create. Now, one thing to be aware of as you're working, if you have a lot of pastel pigment on your paper and you're working flat, you want to be aware that you don't allow your palm of your hand to rest and move and alter your pigment. Because the pastel is a soft pigment, it will be easily removed by your hand smudging it or resting on it. So just something to be aware of. Now I have a lot of warm colors here and very few warm colors here. This would be another way where you can kind of alter and integrate your piece by going in with your pastel pencil and adding some of those colors. I like to do things where I'll just come in and make marks in a color that is some color that's missing or needs to be added. So by laying color just with making marks or passages of line, you can integrate your colors again in an easy way, bringing some of this color in and through, connecting just again by letting your pencil skip across the surface. It just brings a little bit of color and helps to connect your composition in a really easy but beautiful way. You can think in complementary colors again, and that will cause it to really have some beautiful drama that can be created. So it's fun to explore and experiment and try new things, new ways of working. And allow the painting itself to direct you, because you probably would go places you wouldn't go otherwise. But by working in a loose way that you allow to develop, you're challenged with making decisions that you may not otherwise have ever been confronted with unless you approach it this way. When we think about how a camera views its subject, it gives everything the same amount of focus. When we look at something, we are selective in our focus. So when I approach my paintings, I like to have one area that has a stronger amount of detail and let other areas simply fade away. But because this is a face, it's important that the elements within that face are structurally sound and also read as though they are fully developed. So here, when we look at this, this eye I've worked on, this eye I haven't. Even though it's in shadow, it needs to have more resolution than it does now. It may not have as much as my main area, but it needs to have more to feel like it's on the same face. We don't want elements to feel separate. And right now it has very little development with the pastels, only with the watercolor. So I could say that this is getting close to resolution if I'm more abstract, but I would need to bring resolution to that eye before I could call it finished. So I'm going to continue to work on the eye a little bit, and then as I'm working here, continue to think about how I would develop the rest of my piece. Now, because it's a small area, I could work with my pastels, or I could go in with my paintbrush, but I'm choosing to go in with my pastel pencils because it gives me the most control in a small space. Now, we talked about the fact that the eye isn't, the whites of the eye aren't pure white. Even in bright sunlight, they do not appear as perfectly white. Notice the gray that I'm using for this eye is actually quite dark. If we compare it to the white of something that's white, quite dark. So we want to make sure that we're careful not to create the whites of our eyes too white, or they'll feel separate or segmented from our face. They'll feel like they're pasted on rather than integrated in the face itself. So this one is in shadow, and I want to make sure that it reads as in shadow. I don't want it to be even as light as this eye, because this eye has more light shining on it. So I can do that with my pastel pencil. I can also do it, if I need to push it back, I can do it by adding just a pass of watercolor over the top of it and then coming back and altering it accordingly. So I want a little more shadow in that eye, so I'm passing a little bit of a little wash of color over the upper part where the shadow is created from the eyelid. Same true of this area. Because there's eyelashes that create shadow, there needs to be a little portion of dark that happens in the upper part of that eye. This one even more so. So now I'm going to work on developing the upper area of the eye, and I think there's many ways we can go with it, but I'm going to paint it. Now, as I pulled in a little bit closer, you can see some of these marks that I also created on the lips. I'm going to soften those, but the idea of volume that you can create just by the way that your mark is laid on your paper, you can create that illusion of volume just the way that you move the mark itself. Now I can come back in, if I don't like the distinctness of those lines, I can come back and smooth some of them and allow some of them to remain, and it'll still give that illusion of volume. Just soften it slightly, but it still has that feeling of volume. So now in this eye, I need to have that upper part of the eye quite dark. Now, I also want to think a little bit about eyelashes, as long as we're here and talking about such things. There is a linear, we talked about the linear radiation of the lines that happen in the eyes. They kind of radiate out like a sunbeam, which is kind of silly to think about, but that's really what it looks like. They have these lines that come out from the center point of that pupil, and within that there's a lot of variety. But the same is kind of true of the eyelashes. They radiate up and out, and when they come to the center point, when you come to the middle of the eye, they're almost straight up and down. And then as they move towards the nose, they begin to slightly tip inward. So they radiate up and out towards the outside of the eye, slowly move to almost upright at the center of the eye, and then tip towards the nose as they move inward. And the opposite is true of the lower. They move out, and then when they come to the center of the eye, they're almost straight up and down, and then they pretty much stop. It's very rare that eyelashes go all the way to the center of the eye here. They usually are almost non-existent or very small by the time they get there. What'll happen, it'll feel very cartoony if the eyelashes are too thick there. So because her head is turned, I'm not going to see the eyelashes and that upper structure as much as I would if she was facing me directly. So I'm slowly building up my color. I also need to indicate the inner part of this eyelid. We talked about the fact that there was thickness that happens in where our eye opens. There's a thickness that occurs because it's actually an opening in the eye. When your eye is turned, you'll see part of that on the outer eye. You'll see a bit of that thickness. It'll catch the light. So you need to be sure and indicate some of that when the eye is turned. Now as it changes in space, some of that will disappear, but it needs to be evident. Now there's more light on this side that would be caught, so my eyelid or my eyeball would be a little bit lighter on this side than on the other. So I can indicate that by just a little bit of highlight. It's important that the highlights of the eyes are somewhat consistent too. When you're working with your pencil, sometimes your point isn't exactly right, so it'll can make marks in a wrong spot, which I just did. But it doesn't take much to help it to read in space. You want to make sure that your pupil is always quite dark and centered. Because this eye is closer than this one will appear slightly smaller than the one that's closer to you, so you need to be aware of that. And it not only will appear smaller, it'll actually physically need to be drawn smaller, which can seem really odd to you as the artist because you're aware of the fact that you're drawing it smaller. But it's important that it does that because otherwise it won't read accurately. I've lost a little bit of my eyebrow definition, so I could choose to draw that in, or I can paint that in. Also, because the nose is turned slightly, it's cutting off a corner of that eye. This side of the eye appears much closer to the nose than this. If you look at the space, it's much more significant. So important to be aware that you have to make those alterations because the face is turned. If the face was looking directly at you, the spacing would be quite equal. But because the face is turned, it needs to change. Now I want to leave some of this mark look of the gauze. So because I covered it up, I want to recreate some of that by making the marks. Now again, a little bit of highlight that would happen in this bony structure of the eyebrow, but I kind of like that drama there. So I have to let that dry a little bit before I can work on it. It's also kind of fun with eyes to add a little more, like exaggerate the color within your eye. So I like this, I want to pick up a little bit of that color and just let it show up
in that eye form. It can be, just make it kind of interesting. Just kind of pop it a little bit. Same thing, I will often allow some of these colors to show up in unexpected places. You know, bring some of that into the mouth. Some of the shadow. I very rarely leave my portraits purely natural color. I like to add other colors to them, but you certainly, that's just a personal preference. You can do this technique and achieve very realistic colors if you want to. But it's kind of fun to incorporate other colors. And even like this chin line, I like that I can see the drawing marks there. I could, if I chose to, I could cover them up, but my choice would be to leave them. But see, even with my pencil, this can be an editing tool. I can cover those lines right up if I wanted to. I could go right up against her face, that jawline, and use it as an editing tool to define and alter. So it's just nice to have the flexibility of not feeling like you made a big mistake that you're stuck with. Very subtly you can change things, or very dramatically you can change things. So, I'll highlight this a little bit. So sometimes portraits I will leave very loose, and other times I will develop them to more of a super real kind of a look. It's just a matter of, again, usually for me it's how I respond to that piece. Sometimes I just feel like I like to let them be a little more, just a little more loose. Other times I feel like they really need to be more developed. And sometimes after I work on it for a while, and I come back to it and see areas that I just feel like they need a little more resolution, and I'll just continue to work them until I feel comfortable with what's happening. But many times they'll have hundreds of layers of color. Sometimes they'll just have a few. Sometimes they'll feel much more like watercolors. Sometimes they'll feel much more like pastel paintings. Now you can see here's an example of the paper doesn't want to allow me to put much more pigment down. It's kind of starting to repel it, and that's just the nature of the watercolor paper, because it, especially the hot press, the cold press has a little more tooth. The hot press has such a little amount of tooth, it doesn't grab the pigment of the pastel, and it won't allow it to be left on the surface. When I'm working on a piece that I know I want to develop more with my pastels, I use something called UArt, and it has a sanded surface, and it allows a lot of layering to be done. So you have to be aware of that. The paper might alter what you're able to achieve, the look that you're able to achieve. But it's just a matter of personal preference and knowing how you like to work. So I can continue to work in other areas. Again, we were kind of, our focus for this piece is the portrait, so I don't want to spend a lot of time in other areas, but just know that I can continue to work in other regions, adding more of the look of feathers if I decide to. I can continue to alter and develop my color there. But I like to use this mark making while developing the portraits, because it does give that ability to give the illusion of volume, and at the same time, for me, achieve the marks that I like. I like to see those drawing marks. So for me, it's a good combination. I use, when I'm working in the shadows, I will typically use violets and blues and greens, and then layer more natural colors over the top of them to achieve a realistic look, if that's what I'm going for. But you can, if all of your components, your pieces and parts are there, if your eye feels like an eye and your mouth feels like a mouth, you can use completely ridiculous colors and still have it read as a correct face. You just need to make sure that you understand the structure that you're creating. This is typical for me. I'll work kind of fast and furious, and then I get tedious and putsy and just decide what I want to say, what needs to be changed. I kind of like that there's a bit of a butterfly wing look happening, and I just let it go from there, let it develop. Alter and add. And now even at this point, if I decided I needed more painting to happen, I could go in with my paintbrush and completely paint in many of these areas, even though I have some pigment, pastel pigment on my paper. I can still go in, as long as I'm relatively careful, and add paint to this surface, even passing over the top of some of these areas. I'm going to show you that, show you the ability to work back in to a relatively highly pigmented surface. Just to give you an idea, if you try something like this and you get a lot of pastel on your surface, how you continue to work that. So I'm going to just show another example on a different piece of paper that has a lot of pigment, pastel pigment on its surface, and how you would work that. So this is an example where I have a lot of pastel on my paper, and I get questions a lot. Can I work back in with my watercolor at this stage? And the answer is absolutely. You can work in with your watercolor, you could work with your pastel, your pan pastel, or your pencils. You just have to be careful. If there's too much pigment built up on your page, it can become a little bit chalky. But there's quite a bit of versatility and quite a bit of layering that you can do back and forth between watercolor and your pigment, your pastel pigment. So I'm just going to show you how I would go about doing that. Because I have so much pigment on my paper, I can use the pigment that's there, just move it around to create some of these beautiful marks that are happening within this beard. If I need some more darks brought in, I can just paint some more darks directly. But I know that I'm going to then have to come back in with pastel as well. I want to make sure that when I do that, the paper itself is dry. So if you're working interchangeably between watercolor and pastel, just be sure that you've allowed your paper to dry before you mark with your pastels, or what it can do is remove portions of the surface of your paper and just cause it to be kind of a yucky effect. So make sure that if you choose to do and work this way, you let those underlayers dry. So I want to bring a little more shadow. I can simply paint in right over the top of it, let it dry, and then come back in with my paints. But it's a nice variety. The brush has a very distinct quality of mark to it, and the pencil has another. So I always like to have variety of marks within my work. So any way you can work to achieve that, I think, is for your benefit. So I'm just adding some. wherever I tend to add it mostly where I feel like I want my darks. It's easier to add the darks than it is to paint back in and add a lighter color or completely alter a color. It's more specific and you want to use it in a more controlled way to emphasize your darks specifically. So hopefully that's helpful. And then I would let this dry. I would let it dry completely, and then I would come back in with my pencil and I could add more color, more hair, more highlights, and adjust back and forth my values from dark to light. Dark painting, and then lighter colors and light using my pastel pencils. I can also alter my skin. I have areas where it's very skin colored. If I felt like I wanted to have more shadow, I know this area is dry, I can layer pastels in over the top and cool an area down very easily just by putting a passage of cool over the top, and all of a sudden I've created shadow. So, just another way to work. You can do that with washes in the underpainting of paint, or you can do it by adding pastel pencil over the top of another color. You can continue to build and build.